The impact of divorce on parents and children alike can be traumatic. This is true even in cases where the children are healthy and relatively well adjusted. Imagine then how much more devastating it is when a child of divorce is diagnosed with a terminal illness. Their parents must set their differences aside and come together and work together for the sake of their child. Fortunately, there are organizations which help such children and their families, and we'll be talking to one of them today on Fathers Are Parents Too. Welcome to Fathers Are Parents Too. We're here today with Sylvia Zanello, and Sylvia is the Executive Director of the Make-A-Wish Foundation. Sylvia, why don't you tell us a little bit about what your organization does?
Our foundation is a nonprofit foundation that's specific mission is to grant wishes to children who are suffering from a life-threatening or a terminal illness. These children are between the ages of 2.5 and 18, and when suffering from a life-threatening illness, this life-threatening illness prevents them from reaching their 18th birthday.
So that's a criteria, is that they have to be minors, basically.
Exactly.
Okay, now how do they end up coming to your organization, and how do the parents, I'm assuming they're involved in this process, so how does a typical case go that way?
Absolutely involved in the process. Majority of the children are referred to us by the parents, sometimes by doctors, nurses, social workers, and hospitals themselves where we have outreach programs. When the child then is referred, usually the parent calls. The parent then speaks to our program services manager and then talks about the child's illness. Then we talk to the social worker or the caseworker or sometimes the doctors to verify the child's illness and verify the child's age and those types of criteria. Once that happens, then we alert the parents that we send volunteers to the house to interview the child. And then we ask a very simple question. If the child could have, go, do, be, meet anyone, anything, anywhere in the world, what would it be? And from then on, they just dream the magical dreams.
Wow, and you guys try and make it happen for them.
Absolutely.
Now what happens if the parents, obviously if they've contacted you, they're involved, so they agree with your involvement. What happens if the child says they want something and the parents are, well, you know, we're not sure we want them to have this particular wish? What happens then?
When instances happen that way, what we do is we work with the family as a group. Most of the time the children ask for things that are quote-unquote age appropriate. Sometimes they go beyond those parameters, and then we work with the family, specifically the mother and father, to come to some sort of terms, because what we want this to be is the fulfillment of a child's imagination. So we don't want to impede that. So we really decide whether it crosses the line in a safety issue or perhaps an age-appropriate issue, or if it's just something that the child would like. For instance, we had a case where a little girl wanted a horse, and there wasn't any room in the backyard for the horse. The panic set in with the parents. And so we were able to work out a situation where we could border the horse somewhere else. So, you know, we work with a compromise situation, sure.
So now you're talking about working with the families together, and as I opened the show with, in the case where the parents are disunited, either separated or maybe were never married or are divorced, how do you still try to get both parents involved in this process?
Absolutely. As part of the Make-A-Wish Foundation, we need both parents' input in the process because we have them fill out a certain number of forms involving liability and to be sure that they understand everything associated with the wish. So in a case with divorced parents, the mother and father are obviously living separately. What we try to do is get the parents to unite some way, and we oftentimes try to get the volunteers to work with the parents separately to get them to come together to a common place, usually the mother's home or the father's home. Sometimes we do it in other situations at hospitals and things like that. But what this process enables the parents to do, especially in divorce, what I've found, is it brings the family that has been separated and also suffering from the trials and tribulations of having a child who's suffering from such a terrible illness together in a whole different light, focusing on something positive. And oftentimes we find that they're much more amicable than they thought they would be when we first bring up the idea about the fact that they have to all be together.
So you almost end up acting as a catalyst to allow these parents to come together and work together for their ill child.
Absolutely.
Now, what do you find is the sort of typical situation in that case? I'm sure, you know, mom is probably the one who's contacted you to start with, and then do you contact dad, or has, you know, how do you bring the non-custodial parent into this process?
Most of the time with parents of divorce, as you said, most of the time the parents, the mother contacts us, and we work with the mother predominantly. What we do is we ask the mother if she wouldn't mind contacting the father. If the situation is less than amicable, oftentimes we do the contacting and working with the father separately from the mother.
You're not ever in a position, are you, where you're the one, I mean, this is the first time he's heard his child's ill? I mean, I hope that
occasionally we are put into a situation, not necessarily when we are the ones that are the messenger of the terrible news, but oftentimes we are communicating for the very first time everything associated with a wish. Most of the time, some of these fathers don't even know about the foundation,
wow,
and their concerns are with the fact that they have not a very amicable relationship with the mother, that maybe the mother is trying to undermine somehow or get something from the wish separate from the child.
Mm-hmm.
And then what we find is once they all get together and experience this whole magic of empowering their child, whose diseases rob them of this power, then the walls start to break down. And we find that oftentimes, as a perfect example, a mother and father were not on speaking terms at all. And we contacted the father through the phone number given to us by the mother and put them together, and the child's dream was to go to Disneyland. And through this whole process, the mother and father decided that they'd all stay in the same suite together. And these people hadn't spoken for 3.5 years.
Wow.
And I received a letter from the father, as a matter of fact, saying it was such a memorable experience and it really brought the family together. Now, he and his ex-wife will never be married again, but they were able to socialize in a situation that they never expected they would be able to do. Unfortunately, we hate the reason they were brought together, because we're trying to deal with a child who has terrible illness and creating a lasting memory of a lifetime. But it's kind of a nice bonus to have something like that happen where it probably never would have.
Well, you probably afforded them the opportunity also to co-parent their child in a way that they hadn't since, I mean, if they were that polarized. And that makes me think that even though what you're granting is a wish to go to Disneyland or to have a horse, that perhaps, maybe not intentionally, but you're actually providing another wish that most children have, which is they get to see their parents not together, reconciled, but, you know, so many children of divorce, healthy or otherwise, are dealing with their parents always fighting when they're together. And so what a nice thing to be able to give a child some peace and to give them their parents working together for them, and that's wonderful.
That is very true, especially since oftentimes these children believe that they are causing so much pain and suffering for their family, that they are because of their illness, it is they that must rescue their family in such a way, and oftentimes the wish encompasses a family travel vacation, either a cruise or the trip to Disneyland or to swim with the dolphins in Hawaii. Mm-hmm. We just did a wish where we had a little girl who took her family to Waikoloa to swim with the dolphins, and that was an amazing, amazing wish. She spent a good part of the afternoon swimming with the dolphins along with her family, so that was very, very interesting. But they oftentimes want to give back. They feel they've taken so much from the family that they want to give back, and this is a way that they can, especially in situations with divorce, because they're living separate and apart.
So that's something that parents need to be aware of, is, you know, they're sitting there dealing with their own grief, anticipating, you know, the outcome of this illness, and it sounds like they need to hear that their children are there shouldering this incredible burden of guilt, and that the children need to be somehow let off that hook.
Exactly.
Do you have any counseling service for these parents, or just do your volunteers work with them on these issues to make them aware of things they need to be sensitive to about their children's illness from an emotional standpoint?
We don't have any programs directly related to the Make-A-Wish Foundation. We are a wish granting organization. However, we do work with the social workers in an outreach program that brings families that have similar illnesses to deal with together in a variety of extracurricular activities. For instance, the sporting events. We get complimentary tickets all the time for all the different local sporting events in group blocks. So we invite the Wish families to get together. And we have hospital parties. We're doing an Easter egg hunt on Sunday for one of the hospitals that we work with. And we find that through this outreach and getting the parents and the children together, they are able to talk about a lot of the same problems that they face and realize that they're not alone.
Now, going back to the fathers that are out of the family due to the divorce situation, what do you find is, how do I want to say this? I'm envisioning that often the father may have become completely, pretty much cut off from the family. I mean, often in divorce, when it's very high conflict, there's very little involvement by a father who may have been sort of cut out of his child's life for a while. And when you are now bringing them back into the fold that way, is there sort of a typical pattern that they run of either resistance, or they're just so excited to have this opportunity where someone's inviting them? I mean, basically you're inviting him back into his child's life. And is there sort of a standard pattern that runs, or?
Typically what happens that the parents seem to put away their differences, and the father then assumes that role again of the patriarch of the family. And essentially most of the time we find, and this is pervasive through couples that are still married and couples that are divorced, that the father becomes detached from the illness and is the pillar of strength. And so they are the ones that feel as though when we're doing such a kindness for their child that they should give back in some way. And as they feel that need, it tends to show us that they're getting more involved in the family unit again. It's almost like they're acting as though they were involved in the day-to-day raising of the child. So
they're basically picking back up on parenting.
Exactly.
Which is a wonderful thing, and what an awful catalyst to have that happen, but how wonderful that without your organization and someone out, doing some outreach and saying, come be involved in this wish, they might not have the opportunity at all to parent through their children's last days. And
exactly, and especially in a wish that we're doing as we speak, where the parents are amicably divorced. One parent, which is the father, lives in New York City, and the mother lives here with her son, and his dream was to go back and see his family and to see his father before he passed away. And he wanted his wish to include Home Alone, the movie Home Alone, where the little boy is stranded in the Plaza Hotel. Pretty good place to be stranded.
Yeah.
In any event, he just had his transfusion yesterday, and his hopes are so high, and he is so concentrated on the fact that he's going back to New York to see his father and his family that the doctors, who normally would not let him travel in such a state, feel that this is the best medicine he could possibly have. And in speaking to the mother yesterday, she is absolutely thrilled, because in the worst case scenario, if they lose their son on this trip, what better way to go than to be with both parents at the same time. And financially, this couple would never be able to afford that. So it's really very satisfying to be able to provide this opportunity for their son and for the family to maybe have one last visit.
Wow, this is a very wonderful thing that you're doing. We're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back and take some questions from the audience.
Okay.
We'll be right back.
My wish is to visit my grandparents on their farm and pet the cats and ride the horse and just be able to see them.
My wish is to meet the Golden State Warriors basketball team.
My wish is to get a computer to help me in school.
I wish I had a mountain bike because I really enjoy being outdoors.
I like dinner.
These kids aren't asking for very much. Please, help us give it to them.
Welcome back to Fathers Are Parents Too. We're here today with Sylvia Zanello, who's the Executive Director of the Make-A-Wish Foundation of San Francisco, and we have some guests from the audience, some questions from the audience as well. Yes?
Hi, Sylvia. Have you ever had an occasion where a child of divorce or separation has actually had the wish of having their parents be reconciled and brought back together again? And if so, how did you handle it?
Now, I'm going to explain that. I'm going to repeat the question because Sylvia's having a little trouble hearing you over there. He asked whether you've ever had the occasion where a child of divorce's wish actually was, I want my parents to get back together, and how did you handle that situation if so? And if it hasn't happened, how would you handle it?
Since I've been there the past 2 years, I have not been involved with a wish for reconciliation. However, your question is really an interesting one, and I think that if the child's wish was for that, being the organization that we are, is to grant the child's most favorite wish, what a more beautiful thing to try to accomplish. Now, to get more creative, we could do something along the lines and make it fun of The Parent Trap, perhaps. That was an old Disney movie, and try to create some sort of way to get them together, perhaps in an amicable setting like a restaurant or a cruise or something like that. And of course we would work with the parents to let them know what the child wished for, but I think that would be a beautiful wish.
It actually sounds like in some senses you've accomplished that, as we were talking about earlier, where parents may take a cruise together, granted they may be in separate staterooms or whatever, but I mean that's pretty close to a reconciliation from the eyes of a child, I would think, to have their parents together, you know, doing family things like you mentioned.
I think so.
We have another question?
Yes. Do you ever get a situation where you have parents that are apart and they've grown more apart than just geography? They're totally separate and philosophically different, and one parent objects to the wish. What do you do?
We've had that come up more times than I would like. And what happens is, like I had explained a little bit before, that when the one parent tends to think that the other parent is going to get something out of the wish. We had a situation where a mother had custody of the child, but not sole custody, and the child wanted a computer, and the father was absolutely convinced that it was the mother's wish and not the child's wish, and he would not sign the papers. And it was very frustrating because then we as volunteers have to be put in the middle of this situation and deal with it, which is really a very tenuous situation. How we dealt with this particular wish was mediating between the mother and the father, in that we'd have to be on one phone call with the mother talking to her about the father not signing these papers, and then on the other side talking to the father and saying, now this is the child's wish, are you the one that wants to be responsible for the child not receiving the wish? Then working with the child to give him enough courage to speak to both his parents. So the difficulty that poses is that it kind of takes the empowerment part away from the child, which is the main thrust of what we're doing. And it makes it very difficult. It makes it very uncomfortable for us because we then have to be playing referee in a situation like this.
How did that case finally resolve?
Yes, it did. The child did get his computer. We were convincing the father that it was the child's wish, and the final dot on the I, so to speak, was that if the child passed away, the computer then was agreed to be donated to a local library. And that resolved the issue. The father was very comfortable with the fact that the child's mother would not be the end recipient if they were to lose their son.
It's really a shame when parents, and it happens a lot in families of divorce, even with fully healthy children, where one parent will use the child as a pawn to the point where they do become so polarized that neither of them trust the other's motives, and that's really a shame, and I'm glad you were able to overcome that. You mentioned to me earlier before the show that this particular year you have seen a real jump in the number of fathers who are getting involved as volunteers. Talk about that a bit.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because it's really exciting for us. We have over 600 volunteers since our Greater Bay Area chapter spans from Monterey Bay to the Oregon border.
Wow.
Every county west of Interstate 5, so it's 17 Bay Area counties. This year, we have found that we have over 14 fathers that have gotten involved because their child was the recipient of the wish. And this interview comes at such an interesting time because we've been talking to these fathers about why they're getting involved, and one in particular told me that the reason that he's involved is it's helping him cope with the illness. And like I said before, most of the time the father is detached, the father is the patriarch, the father is the one that's the pillar of the family, and he's the one that's going to resolve everything. And what this particular wish father had told me was he said that by volunteering, it helps him work through all the anxieties of the illness that his son is suffering, and especially working as a wish granter, so that he feels that he's better qualified than our regular volunteers because he's already experienced it from a recipient's end. So we're really pleased because normally we get a lot of wish mothers that get involved, but this year there seems to be such an increase, and especially in one area, and we happen to think because of the outreach program and these fathers getting together that one tells the next one, this is a really good opportunity and this is a really good way and very good therapy in working with through the illness.
Now, how can people get involved as volunteers? You mentioned as wish granters. I would assume that's if they have some sort of special skill that people may be asking for, but can people who maybe don't feel they have any special thing to offer in terms of wishes still volunteer, and how can they help?
Well, we have various ways to which people volunteer. Sometimes they work in fundraising, sometimes they work in an administrative capacity, whether it's answering the phones, whether it's selling tickets for an event, whether it's going and participating in different events. And the way that they can get involved is just by calling us at the San Francisco chapter office or one of the 5 field offices. And then they follow a procedure, which is basically getting information, filling out a volunteer application. Once they do that, they get a monthly newsletter, which explains to them everything that's going on with the foundation and how they can get involved.
Now, we have another question from the audience, but before we move to that, I just want to clarify, because this show is seen nationally, so you do have other chapters, and so if people are watching this, say, in Georgia or New Jersey, there are Make-A-Wish chapters there. They shouldn't contact you here in San Francisco, correct? And this just listed in the phone book?
If they want to find a chapter in their area and they're not quite sure which city to look for the chapter, they should call our national foundation, which is 1-800-722-WISH, W-I-S-H.
That's pretty easy.
Isn't that appropriate? And let them know where they are and where they wish to volunteer. They'd be more than happy to give them the local telephone number.
That's great. That's great. Okay, we have another question from the audience.
Yes, Sylvia. With the number of wishes that you've granted over the years, there's got to be one or two that stick out particularly in your mind. Is there one that comes to mind at the moment?
I love these questions. One wish is one of my favorite ones, and it's about a little girl, and I did not actually grant this wish as a volunteer, but a wish granting volunteer reiterated the story to me. The volunteer went to the child's home, and we always go in sets of 2, sometimes 3. And no sooner did the volunteer get into the door, but the little girl ran right up to her and says, I know what I want, I know what I want. Volunteer says, yes, what is it? The little girl says, I want to meet God.
Oh.
The volunteers thinking what all you are thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to do now? But fortunately, through the training process, which is an extensive one that the volunteers go through, they are taught that sometimes these children ask for things that on the surface mean one thing, but in reality mean something else. So we have certain pat questions. She said to the child, "Are you sure you want to meet God?" The little girl says, "Oh yes, I've seen him before." "You've seen him before? What does he look like?" Well, the child begins to explain, a man that's not very tall, doesn't have much hair, wears glasses, and smokes a big fat cigar. She's talking about George Burns. She had seen the movie Oh God in the hospital on video cassette, and that was her wish. And fortunately, this was about a year ago, and George was at the time not feeling too well. However, he had his jet flown up to San Francisco, picked the little girl up. They flew back down to LA. They spent the afternoon together, had lunch at his home, and he sent her back to San Francisco with an autographed cigar and a picture.
Wow.
So she got her wish. That's one of my favorites, absolutely.
That's a wonderful story. Well, we have about just a couple of minutes left, so I was going to ask you for another story. Do you have one that's really quick that you
Really
can tell us?
quick, we have one that we did recently with a little boy who's 7 years old, and he's very interested in the military, and he wanted to be an Army guy and drive a tank. And so we weren't quite sure how to deal with this because we never had a request for it. So we did some investigation. We talked to the local Army base, and it was wonderful. They treated him so beautifully that by the end of the wish, he had more medals on his chest than he knew what to do with. He had gone through a simulator which simulated an actual tank in the desert. And they had lunch together, and they gave him a military salute, and just a magical, magical day. And the child just was on cloud nine. We received the most beautiful letter from the parents saying that they had not seen their child smile since his illness, and they appreciated the fact that we were able to do that.
That's wonderful. Okay, we have about 30 seconds left. So, one piece of advice that you would give divorced or separated parents that are confronting this situation with a terminally ill child, if there was one thing you could say to them all, what would it be?
Please refer your child. You will not believe the magic that it will create. Because we believe lives are measured by memories and not years, and we want a chance to give your child this special memory. So please call the foundation.
Sylvia, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week on Fathers Are Parents Too.